Hello chess fans and welcome to Chess 5, and today's video is just going to be awesome because in today's video we are going to talk about the Caro Kann defense. This video wasn't just highly demanded, that's why I decided to make the video on it. Because Caro Kann opening is actually very pretty famous and pretty solid opening. This opening is played by just a top level grandmasters, even Alireza Firouzja, who just recently won chess.com FIDE Grand Swiss 2021 and have been selected for the candidates 2022. So we can definitely say that it is an high level opening. So definitely it must show, I think I must show you this opening, how to play this opening and what are the cons and what are the benefits of this opening basically. So in today's video, I'm going to cover the three variations. First of all, what is the Caro Kann variation? I must show you. The Caro Kann variation starts with 1e4 and black replies with c6. We have the Caro Kann. So after c6, the most natural move for white in the position is to play d4, grabbing more space in the center. This is the most natural way for white to play the opening. And after g4, black replies with d5. And after g5, in today's video I'm going to cover the three variations, which are, first I'm going to cover the advanced variation, second I'm going to cover the exchange variation, and third I'm going to cover the knight to d2 or knight to c3 variation. Okay, so first if I talk about the advanced variation, after d5 white starts with 3e5. After e5, there are two main moves. Black can either go for bishop f5 or he can go for with c5. I'm basically a French player. First I must show you what is the French line. French defense starts with 1e4 and we have e6, d4, d5 and we have e5. And here black replies with c5. And the basic problem of this opening is, you can see the bishop on c8 is actually pretty bad because of the pawn on e6. If the pawn would have been on e7, the bishop would have just simply swing over to g4 or perhaps on f5 and black is perfect. But in the Caro Kann case, we have actually solved this problem because after pawn push, black can pawn push. After c5, we can say that now the bishop is open to go on f5 and black is actually having no problem. So after c5, white is actually having two options. He can either capture the pawn on c5 or he can either push the pawn to c3 to protect the pawn on d4. If he tries to first capture the pawn on c4, then we are going to simply push e6, and after e6 our bishop is hitting the pawn on c5, and if white will try to protect the pawn by playing bishop e3, which is the most common reply, then first we are going to play knight to d7, hitting the pawn on c5, double attack, and the e5 pawn is also hanging. So the only way for white to defend the pawns is to play bishop to b5, hitting the knight. And now we are going to play queen to a5 check, and it's a check. The bishop is attacked as well, so white is forced to play knight to c3 to protect the bishop and also cover the check. And now black is going to play a6, hitting the bishop. So white is forced to capture the knight, or else if white bishop just pulls back, then the c5 pawn is simply hanging. That's why bishop into d7 is forced. And after bishop into d7, if white is clever, then white can play a3. The idea is very simple. Black cannot actually capture the pawn on c5 because white is having a powerful move, which is b4. Hitting the queen, hitting the bishop, it's winning for white. That's after a3, black should simply play queen c7. And now both the pawns are attacked, and there is only single way to defend both the pawns, which is queen to d4. After queen d4, black can simply play knight e7, and after knight e7, black can play knight c6, hitting the queen and the pawn, or even knight f5 also hits the queen and the bishop, and it's better for black. So this was the first variation. If I talk about the second variation, what will happen after c5? If white plays c3, then black can go for knight to c6, developing the knight and putting pressure on the d4 pawn. Knight f3, bishop g4, simply developing the bishop, which is never possible in the French defense. After bishop g4, white plays bishop e2 and black can capture the knight. First of all, if I analyze the position, if you never play the French or the Caro Kann variation, I think I'm I must make you understand what is happening actually. So basically in the Caro Kann, in this current position, white is having more space in the center and black is actually having less space. But the disadvantage of having more space in the center here is, you can say that d4 pawn is actually pretty weak. Because when we exchange the center pawns, we can say that there is no protection in the pawn on d4. Black can simply play queen b6, hitting more pressure on the pawn on d4. Even there is some pressure on the b2 pawn, and black is actually doing pretty fine. So this is what happens in the French defense or the Caro Kann. Basically in the French defense, because black usually put pressure on the d4 pawn and white is actually having more space. So this is the advantage and the disadvantage of the French. So after bishop e2, the most simplest way to continue the position is to play bishop into f3. After bishop into f3, black can play e6. And now it's simply protected. The black pawn structure is pretty nice and it's well. If white castles, black can play simply bishop e7. There are two moves. Black can play bishop e7 or black can even play knight e7. Knight e7 is also pretty fine because the idea of knight e7 is very simple. Black can play queen b6, capture the pawn in the center, and put his knight to f5. And there would be a triple attack on the d4 pawn, as well as there would be some pressure on the pawn on b2. So this is the common idea. But you can also play bishop e7. And after bishop e7, the most natural move looks like a rook to e1. After rook e1, you can capture, and you can play queen b6, or even developing the knight on a6 is pretty fine. Knight a6, the idea is very clear. Black wants to play knight to f5, putting more pressure on the pawn on d4. And if white tries to capture the knight on h6 with a bishop, then after g into h6, all those who plays attacking chess or who likes to play the attacking chess, I think this is the best position for you. You can simply play queen d7, do a long castle, or else if you don't want to do a long castle, you can play something like queen c7 or queen b6, put the king to d7, and put the rook to g8, g6, join another rook, and simply attack. Yeah, your favorite stuff, attack. So this was the second variation which I just covered. So first of all, if I tell in any opening, it doesn't matter actually. The basic things you need to must do is, first of all, you need to develop your minor pieces as quick as possible. This is the basic and the most important stuff you need to know in chess basically. Okay, if you develop your minor pieces as soon as possible, then I think you are having no problems in any opening. Okay, so this was the advanced variation I just covered. I must show you just once again. After c5, white is having two options, capturing the pawn or pawn push. White can also play actually knight to f3, but knight f3 is actually not working because black can simply capture the pawn on d4. And after knight into d4, black can simply play knight c6, hitting the knight, hitting the pawn on e5 as well. So after knight into c6, b into c6, the basic idea for black can be, black can develop the bishop to f5 or g4, it doesn't matter, or else he can play e6, develop the knight to e7, c5, knight c6, bishop e7, castle, bishop b7. I think black is perfect. So this was the advanced variation of the Caro Kann. So now let's move to the exchange variation of the Caro Kann. So the exchange variation of the Caro Kann starts with 1 e4 c6, d4 d5, and we have e into d5. After e into d5, we have c into d5. After c into d5, there are two common replies for white. White can either play c4, or white can either play knight f3, or he can play knight c3. It doesn't matter. Both lead to the same position. That's why there is c4 and this knight f3. Okay. If I first talk about the c4 variation, after c4, white can play knight to f6. After knight f6, basically what black is preparing here is, black is like, okay, I'm not going to focus much on the center, but I'm going to basically develop my minor pieces and I'm going to play the game. So we have knight f6, knight f3. If white tries to capture the pawn on d5, you can simply capture the pawn with the knight and you can simply develop the minor pieces. And the white weakness is the center pawn on d4 because it's an isolated pawn. So black is already better. So we have knight f3. knight c6, knight c3, and after playing knight c3, the most common replies in the position for black looks like to develop the bishop to f5 or to play bishop to g4. But sadly, this is what white wants. After bishop g4 or bishop f5, actually queen b3 is already very powerful for black. For white actually. If you try to play bishop f5, I can play queen b3, hitting the pawn on b7 and on d5. So this is the main problem which black faces. That's why at the place of developing the bishop, a much better move in the position would have been to simply push your pawn to e6. And your position is actually very solid. Definitely it looks like the bishop on c8 is doing nothing. But if first of all, if white tries to capture your pawn, then after pawn takes, your bishop is widely open. You can play bishop d6 and castle and you are perfect. And second, if white tries to play something else like playing bishop d3, then you can capture the pawn on c4. After bishop into c4, you can simply first develop your bishop, castle, and if white develops the bishop, you can first play h6, asking the bishop what he wants to do. If he goes back, then you can play simply first bishop e7, because this knight to e4 is actually very powerful. So you can first play bishop e7, and after rook e1, now black is thinking, how should I develop the bishop from the c8 square? Now you can simply play b6, and after b6, you can simply put your bishop to b7, and you are having actually the best bishop. You can play rook c8, and your all pieces are developed, and you are having a perfect game. Okay. So this was the variation, and so this was the c4 variation. And now if I talk about the knight to f3 variation, so in knight to f3 variation, the same phenomena is that you simply need to develop your p6. You have knight f6, bishop d3, knight c6, castle. Now you can develop your bishop, because now there is no c4, so that the queen can come on b3. So you can develop the bishop. We have c3, e6, bishop develop. Remember, if white plays bishop f4, then a much better move would have been to play bishop d6, trading off the bishop. But if white tries to play bishop g5, then you must play bishop e7, so that you can move your queen anytime. That happened in the game, bishop g5, bishop e7. And if you will not play bishop e7 and you will go for bishop d6, then something after knight d2, you cannot move your queen from the d8 square, because if you do, then white will simply capture the knight and you are having a bad pawn structure. That's why at the place of playing bishop d6, whenever white plays bishop g5, first play bishop e7. Then after the game goes, then something like knight d2, you can simply castle, develop your rook, and you are having a fine position. Okay, so this is the point. And there is actually one more variation. The most common, first of all, replies to play d4 after c6, but there are some players who does not go for d4 and starts to play knight to f3. Knight to f3 is actually not it's not a much common reply, but it is played by many players. So after knight f3, you don't need to change your plans. You need to stick to your old plan. You need to simply follow your rules by playing d5. This is what we are doing since we have started the video. Simply play d5. White is having options. He can capture the pawn, he can push the pawn, or he can play knight to c3. If he captures the pawn, simply captures the pawn, d4, and you know that it's an exchange variation. Yeah, I just showed you. Simply develop the knight, simply develop the bishop, I simply play on. And if it doesn't capture the pawn and if it tries to play something like pawn push, then as I showed you in the advanced variation of the Caro Kann, you must play actually c5 in this position. Idea is very simple. In the advanced variation, the knight was on g1, the pawn was on d4, and we would like to play the c5 variation. So this is what we need to do in the same case. We need to play c5. We will land up in the same position because white plays c3, we have knight c6 at d4, and we have in the Caro Kann advanced variation. So the third variation, which is white plays knight c3. where black captures, knight captures, and black plays knight f6. We are going to discuss this variation in third part, which is knight to d2, knight c3. Okay, so now let's jump into the third variation, which is knight c3 or knight d2. So we have the Caro Kann, and after d5, white can play knight to d2 or knight c3. It doesn't matter what will white play because black is not getting any affected by it, because black is going to still capture the pawn on e4. So if the knight would have been on d2, white knight would have still captured the pawn. So we have knight into e4, and now we have knight to f6 by black, developing the knight. And after knight f6, the most common reply is to capture the knight on f6. And there's another move, which is bishop d3. First, we are going to talk about the knight into f6 variation. After knight into f6, black is simply going to capture the knight with the pawn. And first of all, the disadvantage of black is, first of all, black is having the two pawns. But the advantage of having this double pawns is, first of all, you are having the free flow of development. You can develop whatever you want. And second, whenever you will castle shot, you can see that you are actually having 4 pawns in your king side, so which will make your king much safer. Okay, which is eventually going to help your king. So you must not afraid from this variation. First, simply play into f6, and if the game still goes on, then white will simply develop the knight. You develop your bishop, get ready for castle. Bishop d3, simply castle. White castles, and now simply develop your bishop to g4 and pinning up the knight. We have c3, and there are two types of players who play c3 or c4. If you are a positional player, the white player will play c3. If he is an attacking player, he would go for c4, grabbing more space. If he is an attacking player and he goes for c4, you must play knight d7, simply develop your piece. If he tries to play b3, his idea is to put his bishop to b2, and he's having a nice bishop, and his pawn structure is also very nice. So after b3, simply play queen c7. Your two rooks are connected. So after bishop b2, simply play rook e8, h3, and you must go back with the bishop on h5. You must never capture the knight, because after queen into f3, white is actually better in the position. Pulling the bishop back is actually better for black, because it makes white a little bit uncomfortable, because the queen cannot move from the d1 square, because black will simply capture the knight, and white pawn structure is very bad actually. Yeah, so pull the bishop back, and the basic idea after bishop h5 here is, you can play c5 at some point after rook d8, and after playing c5, whenever white will try to push the pawn, you can simply put your knight or the bishop to e5 square, and you are playing the perfect chess. So we have this c4 variation. If at the place of c4, if white tries to play c3, you can still play knight d7, rook e1, queen c7. You are simply following your simply play. You are doing nothing else. h3, pull the bishop back. Queen. Here we have queen d2. Actually, sorry, not queen d2. Here we have g4. Actually, you can see that it's a very annoying pin for white. If white is very he's not afraid of his weak king, then he will go for g4, hitting your bishop if he is very irritated from this pin. And then you can simply pull your bishop back to g6. And after playing bishop g6, if white tries to capture your bishop, there are many players thinking like, okay, capturing with h pawn is actually pretty bad. You are having this two pawns in the same line, so it doesn't matter. So it's better to capture with the f pawn. But capturing with the f pawn is actually not a nice move. Capturing with the h pawn is actually a better move, because it looks like a funny pawn structure, but it is actually very worth it. It is very powerful. Okay, so you must capture with the h pawn, because it looks like a funny pawn structure and a very ugly, but it is actually very best. So we have this knight to c3 and knight to d2 variation. We also covered this variation. Let me check if there is another variation or not. Yes, we have covered this knight into f6 variation. If white would play bishop to d3 variation, then after playing bishop d3, first of all, if you are not afraid of like activity, like you can capture the pawn on d4 basically. But if you are afraid of your opponent's development, then you must not go for it, because white actually gets some compensation after it by playing knight f3, hitting the queen. The queen goes back, and definitely it looks like a bit bad for black, in spite of being a pawn up, because white is having a large amount of development already. So if you want to still play a safe chess, you can simply capture the knight on e4, bishop into e4, and you can play knight d7. Idea is very simple. If white tries to play knight f3, play g6, develop the bishop on g7, c3, we have castle, bishop f4, develop the knight on f6, hitting the bishop goes back to d3, now come up with your queen to b6, hitting the pawn, queen d2, developing, protecting the pawn, and simply play bishop g4, hitting the knight. And after playing bishop g4, we have knight e5, hitting the bishop, and here black simply plays bishop e6. And many of you were thinking, why not to simply directly play bishop e6? You can go for it, but after playing bishop e6, white can at some point can play knight g5, hitting your bishop on e6, which is very unpleasant for black. That's why first playing bishop g4, knight e5, bishop e6, and you can put your knight on d5, and you are actually better. You can put your knight to d5, play f6, hitting the knight, play bishop f7 back, and you can open up the position with e5. Okay, so this is the idea of the Caro Kann. So this is the basic idea of the Caro Kann. Okay, so I think I have covered actually all the three lines. So first of all, if you learned anything from these three variations, then make sure to like the video and subscribe the channel if you are new to my channel, and make sure to actually share this video with your friends or to anyone who plays chess whom do you know, because I think this video will also help them to improve their chess level skills. Okay, so if I'm going to come up with these new videos for you, so make sure to click the notification bell after subscribing the channel, so that you will always get notified whenever I would be uploading new videos like this, and you would be the first viewer to watch the video. So till then, stay tuned and keep watching Chess Vibes.